Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 on our series on the Fermi paradox. This episode starring the Kardashev Scale, formulated and named for Nikolai Semenovich Kardashev, an astrophysicist from the former Soviet Union, and I believe a fellow of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He was born in 1932, which makes him into his 80s at this moment. And he is most well known on the international level for his formulation of the Kardashev Scale, as science done in the former Soviet Union is still gradually trickling away to the West.
Right, so we want to talk about the three types of civilizations on the Kardashev Scale. Talk about type 1 civilizations to start.
Originally, the Kardashev Scale was a scale, as the name suggests, to rank and indicate the level of advancement that any civilization will have accomplished, mostly in the context of looking for extraterrestrial civilizations in the middle of the Cold War.
Yeah, well, essentially, type 1 civilizations have the ability to capture all of the energy on their planet.
Not necessarily, but when we're talking about energy consumption and the later instance of the Kardashev Scale that was added on by other scientists, namely Carl Sagan for one, classified type 1, type 2, and type 3 as type 1 is indeed planetary, so at least having the ability to harness the energy from your planet itself, and if we look into technological development affecting things that occur on the planet that we currently are unable to do, because by that definition we are somewhere between type 0 and type 1. That would lead to imagining that it's a fully developed type 1 civilization capable of controlling things like the weather and earthquakes and volcanoes.
Yeah, I mean, accessing all the energy of the planet and having full control. Not necessarily that they do, but that they have the technology to do so.
Yes, it's the potential that you have, not necessarily what you do with it.
Yeah, which currently we don't have. But under the Sagan equation, I think, because part of the Sagan equation is to do with the amount of power produced, we are remarkably close, but we don't fulfill the other technological attributes.
Well, based on the energy consumption, I've pulled up a chart here, and the latest measurement I could find was from 2012, at which point we ranked 0.724 on the scale. And generally speaking, as our society and our economy and our technology has developed gradually, our energy consumption has gone up at a similar pace. So it stands to reason that we're slowly but certainly heading for type 1 and beyond if we do not destroy ourselves.
On to type 2 civilizations.
Type 2 civilizations would be capable of harnessing not just the energy of their home planet, but also of their native star. Imaginably, by our limited knowledge of science, with something like a Dyson sphere or a Dyson swarm,
or a Dyson net,
something along those lines, where you encompass the entire star and just collect all the energy that it exerts as a result of its fusion reactions.
But if you throw in Michio Kaku, he said just controlling a solar system like you would have a Type 1 civilization on numerous planets would be similar to being a Type 2 civilization in actual energy produced.
There is something to be said for that, but that taps into one branching off of the original Kardashev scale, as it was first formulated by Nikolai Kardashev, and later, after that, once it reached the West, nuanced by Carl Sagan, it started to mutate, if you will, into several other instances. There's something that Robert Zubrin has proposed in approaching the Kardashev scale not by a level of technological advancement or energy consumption, but keeping it a lot more simple in just looking at colonization efforts and seeing how far a society and a civilization has colonized its surrounding celestial bodies. So a Type 1 civilization would just be a full planetary society where it's one intercommunicating planet which has been fully colonized. Type 2 would be full colonization throughout one solar system, and type 3 would be colonization throughout other parts of the galaxy as well, which would make it quite a bit simpler to classify any society as a type, as opposed to having to calculate their energy consumption and cross-referencing it with their technological development. But that's just one idea on how you can approach the concept.
Yeah, that's true, because no matter what power constraints we would put, future technologies may well be able to surpass anything we can think of, even if it wouldn't be under the classical classification of the Kardashev scale in the way that it would work. So putting the Sagan-like amount of power produced might not be a very good idea if you think about it in scientific reasoning to do with the Kardashev Scale?
Well, the original ideas behind the Kardashev scale were, of course, formulated in the middle of the Cold War, and our worldview has changed quite a bit since then. I believe the original scale is from the 1960s, although I do not have an exact year for you. But obviously, our projection on energy consumption, how we approached that then, not anticipating newer technologies, and not anticipating how the world would change politically and technologically, would mean that the original estimates would be quite outdated. Therefore, constant revision and looking at the scale and nuancing it further in order to stay up to date with the knowledge that we have as a scientific body, as a species, will remain essential. And that's why it's interesting to keep looking at it from different perspectives. I mean, Zubrin had one approach in approaching it from a colonization effort, but Sagan later postulated the idea of looking at the Kardashev scale, and particularly the aspect of technological development of it, by measuring the information that a civilization outputs and measuring that in bits, and then using the bit count that you come up with to input into a mathematical formula, and in that way calculate their ranking on the scale.
You mean bits of data, of course.
Yes, that's right.
Like computer data, yeah. Oh, yeah. No, that could be done. But before we get carried away with Type 2, we should talk about Type 3 quickly and then go on to the nuances.
That's probably a good way to go about it. Well, as it would stand to reason, Type 3 is a galactic civilization, and on the traditional scale, harnessing the energy of your entire galaxy, so clusters of stars, and of course being able to just intertravel in between a galaxy at will, and perhaps between other galaxies, with technologies that are currently somewhat beyond our imagination and certainly beyond our capabilities. And that is as far as the original scale ranks. Now, there have later been ideas to expand it further, universal civilizations, going further to other galaxies or other universes, if there is such a thing. But that dips into the realm of imagination rather than science.
Well, of course, as FTL was not a proven or even possible theory as we know at the moment.
No, but therefore, once you dip into the realm of imagination, if you're talking about a scientific concept, then it's probably best to curb your enthusiasm at some point or another.
Yeah, I would agree. But, okay, essentially, it's quite familiar. If you are a Type 1 civilization, it's quite easy to move up to a Type 3 civilization, given a very short amount of time.
How do you figure?
Well, if you look at the amount of time it would take you to get all of the technology necessary to harness all the energies of a planet, it would be you'd have plenty of excess energy to then build a Dyson swarm or colonize other worlds in your own solar system. Quite easily, you'd have plenty of energy. And once you get to those, you don't have to develop the technology.
Why wouldn't you have to?
Because you already have it. You have the technology on your home world, which you've developed. Okay, there might be some certain energies you would have to adapt to, but essentially planets are very similar in the mechanisms which run them.
Well, it depends on what you mean by tipping into the energy of the planet. I mean, you could harness the heat of the core of a planet, but not every planet has such a thing. Not every planet has volcanic activity, and not every planet has tectonic plate activity, which are all present on our planet. And with some imagination and sufficient technology, you could harness all of those processes as an energy source. But you'll find different options for that on different planets. So I think if we put that into practice in the long-term view of our species, then we might be hitting bumps in the road and be faced with surprises.
Yeah, I'm not saying there wouldn't be challenges, but if you could essentially do that to one planet, I think it would be very easy to become a Type 2. And then with that, we'd still need time to become a galactic civilization, given the limitations of transport throughout the solar system or further.
Well, the transition into a Type 1 civilization is really quite a bit of a potential breaking point or a bottleneck.
Oh yeah, I agree. That's the pinnacle. That's the hardest part of the Kardashev scale, is breaking the first stage, not the last.
I would agree with that. I mean, there is always the risk of destroying yourself. But if we look at the colonization interpretation of the Kardashev scale, then once you've managed to colonize something outside of your own solar system, then you are pretty much safe from anything known to science. I mean, even even if a supernova should occur with any given star, if your technology is advanced sufficiently enough to just move to another star far away enough from the supernova, you'd be safe. So as long as your species is spread out and have colonized at least part of the galaxy, at least beyond the home star system, then it would be very hard to wipe out entirely.
Yeah, well, it's a bit like if you have lots of seeds, but if you've only got one seed and that seed is destroyed, but if you've got like 10 seeds and 8 of them are destroyed, completely annihilated, 2 seeds still have a better chance than the original one.
Basically, boiling down to don't carry all your eggs in one basket.
Well, yeah, that's essentially it, which is, what was it? Yuri Gagarin said, the Earth is a cradle, but we can stay only so long inside the cradle.
Now, I kind of wanted to touch a bit more briefly on the further nuance on the Kardashev scale of measuring the advancement of a civilization by its information output measured in bits.
I'm not familiar with that, but you're welcome to re-inform me.
Well, it's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, as you probably know, before we had the advanced technology that we have today, like the internet, and like being able to basically intercommunicate with anyone on the planet at will at any given time.
As we are now.
Yeah, for example. But before that, when a lot of filing with government systems and businesses was still done simply on paper, then there was a lot less information in bits per person than there is now. I mean, I believe we, on average, create more data from everything we do online, from all the pages we browse, from all the information that's stored on us, all the advertising content that goes through. I believe we generate more data in a month than we did in a lifetime 100 years ago. So that, again, is something where if you add exponential technological growth, the formula can kind of collapse in on itself because it's just something it didn't anticipate for. But measuring it in bits, megabytes, gigabytes, tera, peta, exabytes, just looking at that of the entire information collection and output of a civilization as a whole will end you up with a figure. And if you can place that on the scale, it becomes another interesting perspective to look at how that society progressed, as opposed to just looking at their energy output. I thought it was an interesting nuance, so I figured I'd bring it up.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose if you factored in doubling effect, which I think is now actually wrong because there are physical limitations to materials.
You were talking about Moore's Law?
Yes, Moore's Law, of course. That computing technology doubles every year and a half, isn't it?
18 months. Yes.
Year and a half. But yeah, they have found, like, now that even modern microchip, I'm not meaning the things you buy in the store, but the ones in development are no more than 3 or 4 atoms thick, and at that point the quantum interference from electrons is just something computers based on binary systems can't work on.
Well, at some point you face a barrier that your current technology and expanding on your current existing technology just won't suffice anymore. I mean, we're kind of reaching the limits of what silica chips can do. And I believe there are several universities looking into technologies for actual quantum computing of individual atoms interacting with one another to replace microprocessors. To do that purely at the atomic level, where quantum effects come into effect. As Richard Feynman said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. But when you look at the crazy shit that atoms and subatomic particles do, as in being in several locations at the same time, the Schrodinger's cat principle, then imagine how, if we could properly tap into that potential, how we could harness that for calculations. If you can make several calculations with the same atom in the same instance, then you're going beyond what macroscopic technology we're currently using for computing. And if we manage to fully use the potential of that, then the sky's the limit.
I would suppose it is, but it's still going to take a long time, I think. I think quantum computing is a long way off.
Well, at present, the greatest calculation I'm aware of that a quantum computer has managed to make is 3 times 5 equals 15. But what we are able to put into practice with our limited technological understanding will have to become apparent over time. I think there are a couple of long-term projects underway, but I'm not technologically sufficiently literate to comment on the viability of those initiatives.
Never mind, but that's because we both understand quantum mechanics.
Well enough to understand that we don't.
Exactly. But any closing statements you'd like to make about Kardashev Scale?
Actually, before the closing statement, there was one interesting thing that I came up against while researching the topic, and that's one last interpretation of the Kardashev scale formulated by someone named John D. Barrow, called microdimensional mastery, which looks at the Kardashev scale and the advancement of a civilization in the context of how small of a technology they've managed to master. I mean, if you look at the primitive civilizations who just worked with their hands and crafted bones or rudimentary metals like the Bronze and the Iron Age later, then you're just working with what you can see. But later on, you go into smaller and smaller technologies. That's apparent with computing technology in our civilization. But if we look at surgery, we go into smaller and smaller bits, and looking at technologies to affect individual blood cells in medical applications. So if we manage to gradually, slowly, but certainly go smaller and smaller in the biological, going from the cell level to the DNA level, and in other areas going from the chemical level, affecting individual molecules, and after that individual atoms, such as with quantum computing, then eventually if you go so small that you enter the quantum realm and you go into subatomic particles, or particles so small that they've not yet been discovered, and you manage to manipulate those for your technological ends, then that would be another way to classify the complexity of a civilization.
Oh, that is a fascinating idea.
I came across that, and I think that's interesting enough to dedicate an entire episode on. But I at least wanted to touch on it briefly and give us all some food for thought as to the implications of that concept, because I found it quite interesting.
Oh, yeah, that is... Yeah, that is a good idea. Perhaps a future episode we will devote to such an idea.
Either way, based on the traditional interpretations and the brief branchings off that we've touched on, I think we've kind of discussed the main lines of the Kardashev scale and our place on it. So what the future holds, no one knows. Time will tell. But it is certainly an interesting thought experiment to contemplate.
Yes, and thank you for watching our series, if you've managed to watch all of them. If not, you can look at the old ones if you want. If not, look for something else we've made in the future. I've been Gorilla.
And I've been Dax.
And this was the Fermi series.